Can changing the way you think about stress make you a healthier person? In today's video, I'm going to go through some strategies of how you can reframe the way you think about stress. But before we get into that, we actually have to understand the impact of stress on health and why it's so important to actually create this reframe. So first, you have to break down and understand that stress has a big effect on mental health. And I'm sure you're aware of that if you're watching this video today, because chronic bad stress, and what I mean by bad stress is there's stress that can actually be good. And this is the stress I see is that deadline, when you were in college and you had 2 hours to write your paper. That is good stress to increase motivation and force productivity. But the bad stress is that stress you can never escape from. That stress that affects your sleep, affects your family time, that type of stress. We don't want that type of stress. And that chronic bad stress can continue to anxiety, depression, and burnout. And so what I actually just faced is some strong burnout. I'm overcoming it and working through it, but what I found is that I had this bad chronic stress where I was never able to escape my work, and so it took a toll on my mental health. So it's important to recognize, is it good stress or is it bad stress? Now, one other thing with the impact of stress is looking at stress as a biological response, because that's what it is. When we feel that stress, it's actually just a releasing of cortisol within our body and a releasing of other hormones as well. And that chronic releasing of cortisol can cause health problems. So when we're looking at stress, it's important to understand that the way we perceive it can actually mitigate or exacerbate its effects on our health. So it's so important that when you are looking at stress, you can reframe it. And so that's understanding the impact of stress on health. So the second piece is actually going through this reframing. How can you reframe stress as a positive force? And so we're looking at that positive stress that I was talking about earlier. And yes, you can actually reframe that chronic bad stress, and that can help you as well. So when you're looking at stress and you want to look at reframing it, you want to help it and look at this feeling that you're feeling simply is going to motivate you, improve your performance, and it's going to help you grow because it's going to push you. And especially in those times when you're cramming for that paper or you have a big meeting coming up and you feel that stress because maybe you have to give a 30-minute talk during that meeting, whatever, you feel like that stress, that force to keep you going. And if you can reframe it that way, that it's simply just gonna help you, that can be helpful in looking at it and actually reaping the benefits from the stress. Now, another thing you can do with stress is cognitive reappraisal, or simply reframing how you look at it. So instead of saying, this is a bad force that I'm feeling, actually saying, you know what, this is a good thing that I'm facing. And one of my favorite proverbs or stories is the story of the Chinese farmer. So what he did is he had these horses, and these horses ran away, and the village was like, oh my gosh, it's terrible you lost your horses. And he said, maybe. And then the horses came back with so many more horses. And the village is like, that's amazing. And he said, maybe. And then the horses actually bucked his son off, and his son broke his leg. And the village is like, oh my gosh. Again, they were like, that's terrible. Maybe. And then the army came through the village and was looking for and rounding up all able-bodied men to go fight in the war. And so his son actually got to stay home because his leg was broken. And so by looking at those things, he never gave it a good or a bad. And so when you look at your stress, you don't necessarily have to say it's good or bad, or maybe you can say it's good, whatever works for you. You can just look at it as it is, and it can motivate you instead of saying this is a bad force. And so that's been helpful for me, at least, is that cognitive reappraisal, or simply reframing how I view stress and how it affects me. And so looking at this, and when you're in that moment, when you're feeling stress, just think to yourself, how can I view this as less threatening and more empowering? That statement can really help you flip it on its head, and instead of saying this is a bad thing, to a good thing. And again, you don't want that chronic stress. You don't want to live in stress. At least I don't want to. And so it's important to recognize that if it affects your sleep or biological or family time, then it may be time to consider how you can lower that stress. But again, if it's a meeting or you're cramming, or it's something that could actually generally improve performance, then it can be very helpful. And one final thing with reframing stress as a positive force is that research actually shows that people who see positive stress have better health outcomes. So when they see stress as actually a positive experience, they have a better health outcome with that, as opposed to the people who see it as a negative thing are gonna actually feel that, and it's gonna exacerbate their health problems. So it's important that you do actually work on reframing this, because it does actually show to make you a healthier person. Finally, I have 3 practical strategies that you can use to change your perception. So that's why, I just talked about why it's so important to reframe and some ways you can do it. But there's 3 practical strategies you can go through that can really help you reframe this stress. And one of my favorites is quiet time. Recently, as I've said, I burned out a little bit. And so this quiet time has been extremely powerful for me. It's one of my favorite things to do, And when I'm driving is when I like to do it the most. And so what I do is I actually just turn off everything. I have no music, no podcast, nothing, and it's just complete silence in my car. And it is absolutely amazing. It allows me to go through and filter my thoughts, and it allows me to work through some of that stress I'm facing, maybe why I'm feeling this stress. What can I do to lower this stress? How can I use this stress to improve my performance? Stuff like that. And so going through these things in my mind in a quiet time is very important for me, because we live in such a busy world. So if you can carve out even 10, 15 minutes of quiet time a day, I guarantee you it's gonna make a huge impact in your life. At least it has in my life. And so what I like to do is driving. I also like to sit out on my deck out there and just look at some trees and just breathe and feel that. I feel the quiet time. Walking, so driving, sitting, walking are some of my favorites. You can also just do some deep meditation with breathing. That could be helpful as well. So just where can you allow your mind to not be stimulated and kind of just let it run? And if you could find that place, that can be helpful with stress. Another thing you could do is simply focus on the skill of building resilience to stress. And I do believe it's actually a skill, handling stress. And so what you can do is actually focus on the work, not the outcome. So find a way to focus. What can you do to focus on the input? Because I think what happens with stress is we focus so much on the outcome or what we want that it can make us stressed about it. So instead, if you can focus on your input, like going to the gym 5 days a week, not losing 15 pounds. Or for me, is gathering leads and sending the leads and doing the marketing and doing the sales calls, not the amount of money I want to make. So finding the input that you can control can help control your stress as well. And so that is just simply building resilience and developing that habit of positive thinking, as we talked about earlier. And one final thing is just education. What does stress look like for you and what works for you? And I don't mean education on finding courses or YouTube videos. And yes, these are great. And I hope this video has been helpful so far in educating you. But I mean education on a personal level, an education of what does stress look like in your life? How does it manifest? How does it affect you? But also what works for you when it comes to managing stress. That's been one of the biggest things for me when it comes to managing my burnout. It wasn't that I took everybody's advice, it was that I took little pieces of everybody's advice and set up experiments for myself to see what worked for me. And that's gonna be most important, so you can get that personal understanding, so in the future you can kind of reference what worked for you. And I encourage you to actually conduct experiments. Be like, you know what, I feel this stress, I'm gonna practice 15 minutes of quiet time, or I'm gonna go exercise, or I'm gonna sleep this amount at night and see how I feel. And you can write down what works or what doesn't work. And then what's cool is a year from now, when you're feeling the same way, you can go back to it and you understand, yep, physical exercise and quiet time are my 2 go-tos. You know what I mean? So you could find out what works for you, and it's that personal education that can be very powerful. So changing the way you think about stress make you healthier. And I truly think it can. So if you guys like that video, please write a comment in the description and I'll make more of these.